No one knew who he was, until the four-star general halted the entire funeral and walked straight toward him. What followed stunned the nation. This is the true, unforgettable story of Walter Jennings, the soldier history forgot, but one man never did. A tale of quiet duty, hidden brotherhood, and a final act of honor that shook a cemetery full of power to its core. Watch to the end to witness a moment that proves, not all heroes wear medals, some carry their service in silence. This is a restricted area, sir. Military funeral. Four-star general. No clearance, no entry. The young security guard didn't even lift his eyes as he spoke. Just another old man in an outdated uniform, probably confused or sentimental, standing out of place and out of time. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, quietly, holding a single wilted white lily wrapped in an old strip of cloth. His name was Walter Jennings, and he had taken the 5:15 a.m. bus from Chapel Creek, North Carolina. 2 transfers, one at Durham, another in Richmond, and a final half-mile walk under the rising sun toward the front gate of Arlington Ridge Memorial Park. Inside the gates, it was a different world. Military brass gleamed like glass. High-ranking officers, members of Congress, and international dignitaries filled rows of perfectly aligned chairs. A 4-piece string quartet played softly while flashes from the press flickered around the podium. The casket, draped in an American flag, waited at the far end under a white canopy. All eyes were on the spectacle. No one noticed the old man just outside the fence. No one, except General Clark Remington, who suddenly paused mid-conversation, glancing toward the edge of the ceremony. And the moment his eyes locked onto the figure by the wall, everything shifted. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back at the gate, Walter stood silent, the breeze tugging lightly at the fabric of his worn jacket. His military greens were from another era, Vietnam, to be exact, and though the fabric had dulled from deep olive to a muted blue-gray, it was still immaculately pressed. The brass buttons were no longer shiny, but the boots were polished. The stitching was tight. And he wore his hat low, tilted slightly, just as he had all those years ago. No medals. No ribbons. Just a single, faded unit patch on his shoulder and that one white lily in his hand. The security guard hesitated. "Do you have clearance?" he asked again, more out of routine than expectation. Walter's eyes were pale blue, cloudy now, but still calm. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I just came to pay my respects." "Are you family?" the guard asked, glancing at his clipboard. Walter shook his head once more. "I served with him," he said simply. "A long time ago." The guard's frown deepened. He looked at the old man's hands, wrinkled, steady. At his shoes, scuffed but clean. At the lily. "I'm sorry, sir," he said finally. "We have a strict list. Without credentials, I can't let you through." Walter didn't flinch. Didn't plead. Didn't protest. He just nodded, stepped aside, and stood silently at the edge of the gate. And as the ceremony inside began with polished boots, ceremonial flags, and the mournful sound of bagpipes, Walter Jennings stood outside, alone. Not angry. Not bitter. Just waiting. And unknown to him, someone important was about to remember. Inside the memorial grounds of Arlington Ridge, the funeral was well underway. The air was thick with formality, rows of spotless uniforms, polished medals gleaming in the sun, dignitaries whispering behind dark glasses, camera lenses catching every angle. Today was not just a funeral, it was the national farewell for General Elias Monroe, a 4-star legend who had once commanded Special Forces missions across continents. It was a burial reserved for the elite. Tight security. Every name on the guest list vetted, double-checked. No room for outsiders. No room for someone like Walter Jennings. But Walter didn't flinch. He remained by the outer wall, still holding the wilted lily like it was all he had left of a story no one remembered. The breeze tugged at his jacket sleeve. His shoulders, once squared in battle, were slightly stooped now. The years had pressed down on him, but they hadn't crushed him. He hadn't come for attention. He hadn't come for forgiveness. He came for something simpler, a goodbye. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that someone inside the ceremony had noticed. From across the crowd, standing behind the casket, Colonel Nathaniel Briggs, one of General Monroe's closest aides, had caught a glimpse of the man outside the gate. At first, it was just a flicker, a patch of green beyond the wrought iron bars. But something about that old uniform, the way it hung just right, and more importantly, that patch on the shoulder, it stopped him cold. Colonel Briggs leaned forward, squinting. His breath hitched. "Sir," he whispered to General Clark Remington, the man now leading the ceremony. "He's here." Remington's head turned slowly. "Jennings?" Briggs nodded. And just like that, the gears of ceremony screeched to a halt. General Remington didn't ask for clearance. He didn't wait for protocol. With a sharp motion, he handed off his ceremonial saber, adjusted the cuffs of his dress jacket, and began walking right through the field of polished chairs, past the generals, past the foreign ministers, past the cameras. The crowd fell into a stunned hush as they watched him stride deliberately toward the gates. Walter, still unaware, looked up only when he saw a figure approaching from inside. The general stopped just 3 feet from him. For a moment, the two men just stood there, one in full dress blues, the other in faded green. And then, General Remington raised his hand in a crisp, practiced salute. A salute not offered lightly. A salute meant for equals. "Mr. Jennings," the general said, voice tight with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." Walter blinked, confused. "You don't have to." "With all due respect," the general interrupted, "yes. I do." He turned to his aide, who stepped forward, holding a polished wooden box. In full view of the world's press and the highest ranks of the U.S. military, General Remington placed the box gently into Walter's arms. It was the urn. The ashes of General Elias Monroe. His final request, the general whispered, was that you be the one to bring him home. Walter's lips parted, but no words came. His hand trembled against the wood. "I thought they forgot," he said. The general's voice broke. "We didn't." The silence that followed was unlike anything heard at a military funeral. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It was reverent. There, outside the cemetery gates, the world had stopped. General Remington stood still after placing the urn in Walter's arms, and something unspoken passed between them, something heavier than war, deeper than honor. And then, behind them, movement. From the far side of the ceremonial grounds, past the casket and the honor guard, past the senators and cabinet members seated beneath the canopy, a ripple began. Not through the crowd but through the past. They rose. One by one, the remaining members of a unit that had no official record. Gray-haired men in worn suits, some in faded uniforms with shaky knees, others in wheelchairs with gloved hands. They rose from their seats at the back of the service, standing tall as their joints allowed, and turned toward the gates. It had been over 50 years, but they remembered him. Walter Jennings, the man who had once been the tip of the spear in a unit that didn't exist on paper. Shadow Company, they used to call it. Recon in the thickest jungles of Laos and the blood-soaked hills of Khe San. Men who had been ghosts long before history forgot them. As Walter took a tentative step through the gate, holding the urn of General Monroe close to his chest, every one of those men raised their hands to salute. Not because someone ordered them to. Not because protocol demanded it. Because they remembered. Because there are debts that outlast medals. Because some kinds of courage never make the newspapers. General Remington walked beside him, silently, as they passed through the marble archway. No more cameras now. No more microphones. Just the crunch of gravel underfoot and the sound of old soldiers shifting to attention. Walter stopped a few feet short of the main canopy. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. But something deep in his chest cracked open, not from pain, but from release. His mind drifted backward 57 years, to a different world. It was February 1968. Khe Sanh Combat Base. They called it a siege, 77 days of hell. Mortar shells, collapsing bunkers, trenches filled with rain and blood. Walter had been 29 then, already on his second tour. Hardened, quiet, but fast. That night, it was day 34. The base was shaking again. Through the static and shouting on the radio, he heard it: "Connors is hit. Outside the wire. Taking fire." He didn't wait for orders. Didn't call for backup. He just ran. Through open jungle, no cover. 2 smoke grenades, a flare, and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He found them behind a shattered fuel shed, one man bleeding, the other yelling into a busted comms unit. And Monroe, then a young lieutenant, trying to drag his gear with a busted ankle. "You boys lost your map?" Walter had growled as he dropped smoke and grabbed their collars. No introductions. No hesitation. Just instinct. That night, Walter Jennings didn't save a general. He saved 2 boys who hadn't learned yet that war doesn't wait for permission, and then he disappeared. Until today, the memory of that night in Khe Sanh lingered behind Walter's eyes like smoke, loud, chaotic, filled with screams and fire. But here, at Arlington Ridge, everything was silent. Reverent. Even the air felt different. General Remington stepped to the side as Walter approached the platform. The honor guard, usually unflinching, shifted slightly to make space. A subtle but powerful gesture. Not because they were told to, but because they understood something sacred was unfolding. Walter placed the urn carefully, deliberately on the cloth-draped pedestal just above the folded American flag. His hand rested on the polished wood for a moment, steady despite the tremble in his shoulders. No one clapped. No one dared speak. The final notes of taps began, low and slow, curling through the crisp autumn air like a farewell carried on the wind. As they faded, the hush that followed felt holy. This wasn't for show. This wasn't about ranks or ribbons. It was about memory. About weight, and about a man who had never once asked to be remembered. As the funeral shifted into its final stage, attendees were ushered toward the reception tent across the field, rows of white chairs under a sea of flags. Walter didn't move. He stood just off the path, under a cluster of sycamore trees, quietly observing. He didn't belong among politicians and VIPs. He never had. Then, a soft voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, sir." Walter turned slightly. A young lieutenant no older than 23 stood before him, clipboard in hand, pressed blues immaculate, posture sharp but uncertain. "I didn't see you on the roster," the young man said cautiously. "Are you with the family?" Walter shook his head. "No." "Press? Military attachment?" Walter paused. Then, with quiet clarity, 3rd Recon Battalion. Charlie Company. Khe Sanh. 1968. The lieutenant blinked. I'm sorry, sir. That's not." "It wouldn't be," Walter said gently, sparing him the embarrassment. He offered no ID, no rank. Just a nod. "I'm not here for the program." The young officer hesitated, then nodded awkwardly. "I'll check with my CO." He turned and hurried off. Walter exhaled and turned his gaze back to the horizon. The field rippled with flags and formalities. But under those marble columns, the urn remained untouched, waiting for the only man Monroe had requested. Across the field, a captain in his mid-40s observed everything. Bronze star on his chest, eyes like stone. He'd seen the exchange. And more importantly, he had seen General Remington glance toward the gate twice. The captain reached the lieutenant and asked one question. "What's the situation?" "There's an older man near the trees. Said he served at Key San." The captain looked. Recognition dawned instantly. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for clarification. He turned and walked straight to the command tent. 10 minutes later, the whispers began. Not among the crowd but through the ranks. And then, without fanfare, General Andrew Landon, the newly appointed chief of staff and Monroe's most decorated protégé, stepped out from the tent. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He walked straight toward Walter Jennings, and the past followed him. All movement in the cemetery seemed to freeze as General Andrew Landon, the highest-ranking officer on the field, walked calmly, deliberately, across the manicured grass. He didn't head for the podium. He didn't nod to the dignitaries. His eyes were locked on one man, Walter Jennings. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "Who is that?" Others followed his gaze. A few raised their phones, instinctively, but then lowered them. Something about the moment demanded stillness. Walter stood motionless as the general approached, the white lily still in his hand, its petals curled and dry. When Landon stopped just a few feet away, he removed his gloves, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Not to the flag. Not to the casket. But to the man who had once dragged him bleeding through jungle mud half a century ago. They didn't speak at first. The silence was heavier than any eulogy. Then, finally, General Landon's voice broke through, low and steady. "I told Elias I'd find you," he said. He never stopped looking. Even near the end. Walter's eyes met his. The weight of memory, of battle survived and brothers buried, passed between them like a current. Landon gestured toward the ceremonial convoy idling just beyond the trees. "I brought him here," he said. "But only you can bring him home." An aide stepped forward holding the urn. In full view of military brass, senators, and the Secretary of Defense, General Landon placed the remains of General Elias Monroe into Walter Jennings' hands. Camera shutters clicked. A ripple of awe moved through the crowd. But Landon raised a hand, halting them. "No photos," he said. "Let the moment stand." He turned toward the podium, climbed the 3 steps to the microphone meant for the official eulogy, and spoke not from notes but from his gut. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out over the hushed crowd, "there are moments in military life that live far beyond the battlefield. They're not written in strategy reports or archived in war museums. They live in the hearts of men who came home, and in the silence of those who didn't." He paused, then gestured toward Walter, who stood just behind him, still holding the urn with both hands. "If not for this man, Sergeant Walter Jennings, General Monroe would not have lived past 19. I wouldn't have survived my first command. And everything we built, every soldier we trained, every life we saved afterward, would never have happened." Walter's eyes dropped to the ground, but his grip on the urn never faltered. General Landon's voice thickened with emotion. "If there's anyone who deserves to lead this final walk, it's him. Sergeant Jennings. Ghost Recon, Laos, 1971. For a beat, there was only silence. Then a single clap, then another. And suddenly, the entire audience, generals, soldiers, civilians, even press, rose to their feet, not for the general, not for the ceremony, but for the quiet man in the old uniform. Some saluted. Others simply stood with hands over hearts. They weren't honoring a rank, they were honoring a man. As the applause faded into respectful silence, General Andrew Landon stepped aside, turning toward the man who had once saved his life with nothing but instinct, grit, and smoke grenades. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. "Will you walk with me?" the general asked quietly. Walter Jennings hesitated. Just for a breath. Then he nodded. Side by side, they walked past rows of rigid officers, past polished shoes and metal-laden chests, past camera crews now frozen in reverence. Every step was slow, deliberate. Walter held the urn close, like it weighed more than just ashes. Like it held a brotherhood, a battlefield, and a promise kept. As they reached the ceremonial platform once more, the honor guard parted silently, allowing them through without instruction. Walter stepped forward alone, his shoulders square despite the years, and gently placed the urn above the folded American flag. Not because it was part of the program, but because it was right. He stood motionless, one hand resting atop the urn, his head slightly bowed. The wind rustled through the tall trees above them. No anthem played. No bugle called. Just the silence that held meaning heavy, sacred, unspoken. Then, with a small nod from General Landon, Walter lifted the urn again and turned. And something remarkable happened. On either side of the walkway, soldiers of every branch, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, rose to full attention. Some saluted with youthful precision. Others, veterans in civilian clothes, raised trembling hands beside canes or wheelchairs. Old men removed their hats. Some wept silently. They weren't saluting a uniform. They were saluting a memory. A man. A truth long buried under decades of medals and silence. As Walter passed the family section, the entire crowd had risen. The cameras had dropped. No one whispered anymore. The story wasn't being told with words. It was told in how people stood taller. In how they looked at him not as a forgotten soldier, but as the most honored man on that field. And Walter didn't bow. Didn't cry. He just walked. One step at a time. Each step echoing a life lived quietly, courageously. Long after the final words were spoken and the last guest had left, Walter remained. He stood beneath a tall oak tree beside the fresh grave, where the urn had been placed beneath a simple stone. General Elias Monroe, brother, commander, friend. Walter knelt slowly. The joints in his knees protested, but he didn't mind. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small stick of incense and lit it with shaking hands. The smoke curled upward into the crisp autumn air. He didn't speak loudly. But if someone had been close enough, they might have heard a whisper. "I told you I'd make it." A pause. "You always did hate flowers." He chuckled once, low and fond. Then, quietly, "Rest easy, kid." As he stood again, he didn't turn to leave. Not yet. Because behind him, General Landon was already waiting, holding a small, time-worn envelope. "It was in Monroe's safe," the general said. "He left it for you. But only if you made it to the grave." Walter opened it. Inside, one line written in a trembling hand: "If there's any justice, they'll say my name beside yours." And that finally was enough, for him. And for the country he never stopped serving. 1 year later, under a warm spring sun, a ribbon stretched across the entrance of a newly built facility in Chapel Creek, North Carolina. Local officials stood beside national leaders. Veterans gathered in silence. Reporters adjusted cameras, and flags rippled gently in the breeze. Etched in bronze above the stone archway were the words, "The Walter Jennings Center for Veterans and Quiet Heroes." This wasn't just another building. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing for those returning from war with wounds that don't always show. Inside, there were therapy rooms, workshops for woodworking and welding, gardens of reflection. But most importantly, it was filled with stories. Names that didn't make headlines. Sacrifices that had no ceremony. Pain that never asked to be seen. It was funded by the Elias Monroe Legacy Foundation, approved personally by General Andrew Landon. The crowd waited, cameras ready, anticipating a speech from the man whose name was now carved into history. But Walter Jennings wasn't on the stage. He stood off to the side, hands behind his back, wearing a dark coat and holding a single white lily, its petals curled, its color faded. Just like the one he brought to the gate that day. He didn't wave. Didn't bow. Didn't say a word. He simply watched. Watched as young veterans stepped through those doors for the first time, some limping, some silent, all carrying something invisible. He watched as families sat in the garden under plaques with no famous names. He watched a place rise not from fame, but from quiet service. General Landon approached slowly, joining him without a word. Walter gave a small nod. "I told you I didn't want a building," he muttered. Landon smiled faintly. "It's not a building." Walter arched a brow. "It's a thank you," Landon replied. "Etched in stone. For every man who gave more than he got." Walter looked back at the lily in his hand, then at the open doors. "You think they'll come?" he asked. "They already have," Landon answered. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Walter turned to leave. He walked alone quietly, as always. But something had shifted. Not in him, but in the world around him. Because now, people looked with reverence. They didn't salute him out loud. But in their hearts, they remembered, and thanks to one final walk. So did the country he never stopped serving. If this story moved you even just for a moment, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video to honor those whose service was never celebrated. Comment, "I remember," if you believe quiet heroes like Walter Jennings deserve to be seen. Subscribe to Colorline Stories for more untold stories that challenge injustice and spotlight dignity where the world forgets to look. And share this with someone who needs reminding. True service doesn't ask for recognition, but it still deserves it. Because when we engage, we don't just tell stories, we keep legacies alive.